Thousands of years before the birth of Christ, scattered tribes roamed this ancient land, living without great conflict beneath open skies. But it was the Hittites who lit the first great torch of civilization across Anatolia. Around 1600 BCE, they forged an empire so formidable that even the pharaohs of Egypt gazed upon it with something rare, genuine respect. The Hittites did something that still sends chills down the spine of historians. They sat across from Ramesses II, one of history's most powerful rulers, and signed a peace treaty. Not a surrender, not a capitulation, a treaty between equals. It remains the oldest recorded international agreement in human history, and when scholars first discovered it, many could barely believe what they were reading. Think about that for a moment. At a time when most of the world still had no concept of law, no notion of diplomacy, no framework for resolving conflict beyond the sword, in Anatolia, men were sitting down at tables and negotiating the fate of nations with words. The Hittites were also the first people to harness iron, turning a raw metal into military supremacy. They built cities with towering walls, codified law, and conducted diplomatic relations with Egypt and Babylon. In the ancient world, they were without equal. After the Hittites faded, the Phrygians arrived, and with them came the legend of King Midas, the man whose very touch turned everything to gold. It is a myth, yes, but myths always carry truth within them. Anatolia was a land where wealth seemed to spring from the soil itself. Then came the Lydians, and they gave humanity one of its most transformative gifts: the coin. Yes, money as we know it was born here. The Lydians of Anatolia minted the first standardized currency and, in doing so, rewired the entire global economy. Their king, Croesus, became so legendarily wealthy that his name became a synonym for unimaginable riches. After them, the Persian Achaemenids swept through. But Anatolia always kept its spirit. It was never truly conquered, it merely waited. In 334 BCE, a young man with golden hair and eyes that burned like fire crossed into Anatolia from Greece. Alexander of Macedon, barely 22 years old, marched to the city of Gordium, where a legendary knot sat coiled around an ancient wagon. Prophecy declared that whoever untied it would rule all of Asia. Alexander didn't untie it. He drew his sword and sliced it in two. And then, almost impossibly, he actually went and ruled all of Asia. Alexander was not merely a conqueror of armies. He was a carrier of culture. The cities he founded became blazing centers of intellectual exchange, places where ideas, science, and art flowed like water. After Alexander, Anatolia was never the same again. It wore the color of Greece now, and it was changing, evolving, growing more magnificent with every passing day. After Alexander's death, his generals carved up his empire like wolves over a carcass. But the story truly ignites when Rome arrived and, with characteristic shrewdness, absorbed Anatolia into its vast dominion. The Romans called it simply Asia, a name that would later come to define an entire continent. Cities like Ephesus and Pergamon rose to become the beating hearts of civilization. Ephesus, with its great library, its Temple of Artemis, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, drawing pilgrims from every corner of the earth. Its marble-paved streets, lined with merchants carrying goods from across the empire, was at its peak home to 500,000 souls. 500,000 people in a single ancient city. It was one of the largest urban centers the ancient world had ever seen. Then Christianity arrived, and it swept everything before it. Anatolia was among the very first lands to open its arms to this new faith. The Apostle Paul walked through its cities, preaching in the dust and the heat. Churches were built, communities formed, and when Emperor Constantine declared Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, Anatolia became the beating heart of this trembling new world. Constantine did something audacious. He moved the capital of the entire Roman Empire to a narrow strip of land straddling the Bosphorus, that magical strait where Europe reaches out and almost touches Asia. He called it Constantinople. We call it Istanbul. This city would become one of the most extraordinary places in the history of human civilization. And it all began with one man looking at a stretch of shimmering water and thinking, here, the Byzantine Empire, Rome's eastern successor, endured for over 1,000 years. 1,000 years. While kingdoms rose and crumbled all around it, Byzantium held on, nurturing art, philosophy, theology, and architecture within its golden walls. The Hagia Sophia, with its impossible dome that seemed to float in midair without support, breathtaking and almost supernatural, was the crown jewel of this glittering age. Byzantium preserved the legacy of Rome, fused it with Greek tradition and Christian faith, and created something the world had never seen before and would never see again. But deep in the heart of Central Asia, there were people whom destiny had chosen for a different role entirely. Turkic-speaking tribes were moving westward from the boundless steppes, slowly at first, then with gathering force. They were horsemen of extraordinary skill, warriors unlike any the world had encountered. Life in the merciless plains of Central Asia had forged them into something hard and bright and fearless. When Islam reached them, they embraced it not as a religion imposed from without, but as a truth they recognized in their very bones. The Seljuks, among the most powerful of these tribes, arrived on the world stage in the 11th century. In 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, they shattered the Byzantine army and captured the Emperor Romanos himself. Something so unthinkable, so unprecedented in the long history of Rome, that it sent shockwaves of disbelief across the entire world. That battle was a door, and the Turks walked through it. From that day forward, wave after wave of Turkish settlers poured into Anatolia and transformed its very identity forever. The Seljuks put down roots in Anatolia. Their capital was Konya, a city that would later become immortalized through the poetry of Jalal ad-Din Rumi, the great Persian language mystic poet whose words made people fall in love with spirituality itself. Interestingly, Rumi wrote in Persian, not Turkish, a testament to the extraordinary cultural fusion that makes Turkey so endlessly complex and rich. Turks and Persians and Arabs and Byzantines intertwined. Languages and cultures braided together. And from this magnificent collision, a new identity was born. But the greatest chapter in Turkey's history was still unwritten. In the early 14th century, in a small corner of northwestern Anatolia, there was a tiny tribe led by a man named Osman Bey. Nobody paid them much attention. Nobody imagined that this small borderland clan would one day build an empire stretching across half the known world. But Osman and his descendants possessed something far more lethal than swords. They possessed vision. And vision, in the right hands, changes everything. The Ottomans expanded with intelligence and audacity. They were not only fierce in battle, they were brilliant administrators. When they conquered a territory, they allowed its people to keep their religion, preserve their culture, and continue their commerce. This was not weakness. This was wisdom. Jews expelled from Spain in 1492 found refuge in the Ottoman Empire. Christians, Jews, and Muslims lived side by side, not always without tension, but with a form of coexistence that would have been unimaginable in the Europe of that era. And then came May 29th, 1453, a day that shattered the medieval world and announced the arrival of a new age. Sultan Mehmed II, who would earn the title the Conqueror, was 21 years old when he stood before the walls of Constantinople. 21 years old. The city that had resisted every assault for 1,000 years, sieges by Persians, Arabs, Vikings, Crusaders, finally fell. The Hagia Sophia was converted from a church to a mosque. The Byzantine Empire, that ancient, magnificent colossus, ceased to exist. And Istanbul, this jewel of civilization, became the capital of the Ottoman world. But Mehmed did not come to destroy, he came to preserve. The Greek scholars and philosophers who fled Constantinople carried ancient Greek knowledge into the hungry universities of Europe, and in doing so, inadvertently struck the spark that ignited the Renaissance. At the height of its power, the Ottoman Empire stretched from Morocco to the borders of Persia, from the Arabian Peninsula to Ukraine, from Egypt to Hungary. Sultan Suleiman, whom the Europeans called the Magnificent, and his own people called the Lawgiver, commanded armies that marched to the very gates of Vienna, the heart of Europe. The world shook. The kings of France begged for Ottoman alliances. Venice and Genoa traded with Istanbul on their knees, with the utmost deference and care. Suleiman's name echoed across every continent, feared by some, revered by all. The Ottomans were not only conquerors, they were architects, artists, and scholars. The master builder Sinan, working in this golden era, created structures that still steal the breath from your chest today. The Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne. These are masterpieces that architects from around the world still study in reverent silence. Sinan built over 300 structures in his lifetime. In each one, he uncovered a new secret of the art, and some of those secrets, it seems, have yet to be found. But no empire lasts forever. From the 17th century onward, the cracks began to show. Europe was in the midst of an industrial revolution. Science and technology were racing forward at astonishing speed. Steamships replaced sailing vessels. More powerful cannons were forged. Railways stitched all of Europe together in iron thread. The Ottoman Empire, meanwhile, was still being governed by the methods of a previous century. The Tanzimat reforms of the 19th century were a desperate attempt at modernization. But they came too late and moved too slowly. Military defeat after military defeat, national uprisings across the Balkans, crushing economic pressure. The Europeans who had once spoken of this empire with trembling respect now mocked it as the sick man of Europe. Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, one by one they broke free. Of that vast, continent-spanning empire, only the Anatolian heartland remained. The First World War delivered the killing blow. The Ottomans entered the war on the side of Germany and Austria, and they lost. Allied armies occupied Istanbul. An empire that had ruled 3 continents for 4 centuries now stood at the edge of oblivion, with nothing left to offer. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 carved up Anatolia itself, dividing it among Greece, Armenia, Kurdish territories, and the European powers. The Turks had nothing, no capital, no army, no future. Many believed it was simply over. The story had ended. But history had one more word left to say. there was one man who refused to accept that ending. Mustafa Kemal, a military officer who had stood at Gallipoli and driven the Allied forces back from the shoreline, now stood against the fate of his entire people. He was a soldier, yes, but he was a soldier who read history, studied philosophy, and understood politics with the depth of a statesman. He knew that guns alone would not be enough. You could not save a nation with weapons only. You had to wake its soul. In May 1919, he stepped off a ship at Samsun and struck a spark that became a wildfire. The Turkish War of Independence had begun. From an Anatolia that the entire world had already written off and consigned to history, an army rose. Farmers, peasants, women, men who had nothing left to lose picked up weapons. The Greeks, who had advanced deep into Anatolia with British backing, were dealt a catastrophic defeat in August 1922. Mustafa Kemal and his army drove them back, all the way to the sea. It was one of the most astonishing military reversals in modern history. On October 29, 1923, the Republic of Turkey was proclaimed. Mustafa Kemal became its first president and was given the surname Ataturk, Father of the Turks. The shock of that title, the weight of it, reverberated around the world. This was not merely a changed name, it was the rebirth of a people. The capital was moved from Istanbul to Ankara, a city in the raw heart of Anatolia. The message was deliberate and unmistakable. We are no longer the heirs of a crumbling empire. We are a new nation, a nation with strength and a nation with a future. Ataturk understood that independence alone was not enough. A truly new nation required revolution, not just political, but cultural and intellectual. The Arabic script was abandoned and replaced with a Latin alphabet overnight. An entire people had to learn to read and write anew. It was painful, it was disorienting, but the results were extraordinary. The Islamic calendar gave way to the Gregorian. Traditional dress was transformed. The fez was banned. European hats took its place. The legal system shifted from Islamic law to European civil codes. Women gained the right to vote before many countries in Western Europe. Every day the country rose higher. These changes were agonizing. Many resisted. Many mourned the traditions they were losing. But Ataturk believed, with ferocious, unshakable conviction, that Turkey had to step into the 20th century if it was to survive at all. The years after Ataturk were not easy. Turkey remained neutral in World War II, perhaps the wisest decision it ever made. While Europe burned, Turkey survived in the shadow of the storm and lived to fight another day. After the war, the bipolar world hardened around its axis. Turkey joined the Western Bloc and entered NATO in 1952, a strategic commitment that would define the country's trajectory for decades. But democracy traveled a rocky road. Military coups in 1960, 1971, and 1980 repeatedly derailed the country's path. Each time the army stepped out from behind the curtain, the Constitution was rewritten, politicians were imprisoned, and everything started again from zero. The army saw itself as the guardian of Ataturk's secular legacy, and every time it felt that legacy was threatened, it intervened. The plans kept changing. The 1980s and 90s were saturated with turbulence. Ethnic tensions, the Kurdish question, terrorism, economic crises crashing one after another. In 1999, a catastrophic earthquake leveled cities across northwestern Turkey and killed tens of thousands. Everyone was gripped by fear and grief. But Turkey pulled itself off the ground again, as it always had, as it always would. This resilience was in the soil. It was in the people. At the dawn of the new millennium, Turkey entered a fresh era. The Justice and Development Party, led by Recep Tayyip Erdogan, came to power in 2002. In the early years, the economy grew at breathtaking speed, relations with Europe improved, and EU membership negotiations became more serious than they had ever been. Turkey was becoming a regional power and showcasing a new model of economic development that the world was watching closely. Istanbul became one of the most dynamic cities on Earth. Its population swelled from a few million to over 15 million. The city wore a new skin, gleaming modern towers rising beside ancient minarets, each one scratching at the same sky. Tourism surged, and for years, tens of millions of visitors arrived from every corner of the world to see this strange, magnificent country. 1 foot in Europe, 1 foot in Asia, with their own eyes. Those who came were never disappointed, but the 2010s brought storms. The Gezi Park protests in 2013, the Syrian crisis on the southern border, a wave of millions of Syrian refugees, the failed coup of 2016, which shook Turkey to its foundations. Challenge after challenge, crisis after crisis. And yet Turkey kept moving, kept searching for solutions, kept trying to chart its course. But Turkey is not only politics and war. Turkey is a culture that flows in the blood. Turkish tea, served in those elegant, narrow-waisted glasses, offered at every corner of the country with warmth and generosity, a ritual of welcome, a small daily act of joy. Coffee read from the grounds by women who will tell you things about yourself that unsettle you. The music of the Ashik troubadours, alive and singing for centuries, unbroken. The whirling dervishes of Mevlana and Konya, spinning in their white robes every year, as though time itself has agreed to stop and watch. That circular dance in which a human being spins inward to forget themselves, it is the perfect symbol of all of Turkey, a land that turns within itself, and from that turning, conjures beauty. The architecture alone is enough to silence you. Ottoman mosques with their cerulean domes and soaring minarets that scrape the belly of the sky. Cappadocia, with its fairy chimneys rising from the earth like something dreamed rather than formed. And at sunrise, hot air balloons in every color drifting above them, so beautiful it seems almost unfair. Antalya, with waters so turquoise they have no proper name in English. Ephesus, where broken columns still whisper of ancient glory and pull you backward through the centuries until you can almost feel the heat of a Roman afternoon on your skin. Turkish literature is its own vast universe. Orhan Pamuk, the only Turkish writer to win the Nobel Prize in Literature, captures Istanbul in his novels with all its impossible contradictions. A city where East and West, past and present, wealth and poverty crash together in an endless, gorgeous collision. Nazim Hikmet, the revolutionary poet who died in exile, but whose words refused to die with him. Yashar Kemal, who was the voice of deep, rural Anatolia. This land is where 3 great religions were born and grew tall, where 7,000 years of consecutive civilization lie stacked one upon the other like geological strata. And through all of it, every calamity, every conquest, every catastrophe, it has remained standing. Turkey today is a country of 85 million people, young, energized, and full of contradiction. Its economy is one of the 20 largest on Earth. Its military is one of NATO's most powerful, and it has proven its strength to the world. Its tourism industry draws tens of millions every year. Its drone and defense industries have, in the past decade, become among the most formidable on the planet. Turkey is no longer simply a market or a tourist destination. It is a serious player on the international stage, a country that others depend on far more than they might care to admit. And yet Turkey is still in the middle of its journey, a journey in which it must define itself for the age to come. Is being a bridge between East and West a strength or a burden? Is this land's history of contradiction a weight to carry or a treasury to draw from? Can Islam and democracy sit at the same table? Can Turkey belong simultaneously to Europe and to the Middle East? Those questions will be answered by generations not yet born. What is beyond doubt is this: Turkey has always existed, and it always will. This soil, tilled by human hands for 7,000 years. These waters, sailed by merchants of every age. These mountains, sometimes shelter, sometimes barrier. Together, they have made a Turkey that refuses all simple definitions. Perhaps that is the secret of its enduring wonder. This land never surrendered, not to the Hittites, not to Alexander, not to Rome, not to the Mongols, not to the allies of the Great War. It was always here. It always endured. It always rose again from the ashes. That is what real power looks like.